Alright, the rest of the chapter talks about two basic levels of cognition, memory and executive function, that can influence how we process sentences as well. Starting on page 313, we see that that sometimes sentences become a little bit taxing on our memories. George Miller, Dr. Miller, I don't know his first name anymore, I can't remember, demonstrated that we have a working memory span of something like 7 items, plus or minus 2. So between 5 and 9 things, chunks of information, we can manipulate in our working memory. If we consider that each chunk might be an individual word, then a sentence of only just up to 9 words will be very taxing on our memory. But sometimes we can link pieces of information together that appear in a sentence to create a single chunk, and that we can manipulate that chunk or partial sentence much more easily. So depending on how adept we are at making chunks and at manipulating things in our working memory, and depending, of course, on the span size of our working memory, because some people are lower on the range, like 5, and some people can remember up to like 9 things, 9 chunks of information, then we would say that that these sentences could be I guess, depending on these aspects of memory, sentences could be overly taxing or they could be just fine. And as we see some of these examples here, some of them are, some of the sentences are indeed sentences that are just ambiguous, that no matter how you read them and no matter how good your memory is, you're going to have a problem with it. But there are also some sentences that, if you have a marvelous memory and really good executive control, that you won't struggle with as much as some other people might. These kinds of sentences are those that have embedded clauses inside of other noun phrases. An example of this appears on the bottom of page 314, where it says, "The president detested the reporter who spotted the senator who shouted." Now, that's let's see, there are several examples of this sentence given across the page, and you can read through some of those sentences yourself to see the differences. But basically the point is that because this has so many embedded parts of the sentence, that there's nothing particularly ambiguous about the sentence structure. It's just taxing on working memory because there's so many parts embedded inside of other parts referring to different parts. And that suggests that this is, I guess, that just having problems with memory can be one of the things that influences whether or not you'll be able to easily parse the parts of a sentence. Now, on the next page, 316, there's a box, Language at Large 8.2, that describes some of the characteristics of individuals with, some of the characteristics of good writing. The box states that there are some really great writers, some best-selling authors, in fact, who write in a very convoluted fashion. And one example there is given at the beginning in italics. You can read through, obviously. It's very difficult to follow for even the best of us. And yet, this is written by a best-selling author. How could this be? Sometimes people who have a particularly strong memory span size or really good executive control are good at taking these individual parts of language and sticking them together. And even when a sentence gets really long or ambiguous, confusing, or if there's parts embedded in other parts, it's like a game for individuals to work through if you have the cognitive capacity to play that kind of game. Some people who have poor working memory span sizes, or who are dealing with new information, or who have bad executive control, will be less inclined to read this kind of prose, this kind of text. So even though he might be a best-selling author, you might read through those 2 paragraphs and say, "This is a bunch of hooey, I am never reading this guy." The take-home message, though, is that having to work a little bit to learn something can actually make you process it deeper. It can make the processing understood on a more thorough level and more lasting in your memory. Some other examples are given that don't necessarily deal with the complexity of sentences, but for instance, one example deals with the difficulty of a font to read. If a font is written in a difficult, if a piece of writing is in a difficult to read font, the understanding of that material and the processing, or like how long you'll remember it in the future, will be better, they'll be improved if it's a more difficult font, because it doesn't, the font will require that you focus and pay attention more, and sort of shifts your mind from thinking in just a surface processing mode that relies on these general heuristics, not focusing on the details. It switches your brain into a mode that now is all of a sudden focused on the details and focused on processing deeply and trying to understand something that's difficult. Anyway, so I already said that's the take-home message, I guess. Yeah, so sometimes you can make information a little bit more difficult syntactically in order to improve processing, and also sometimes to improve enjoyment of a piece of text. And that's that.